Welcome to another edition of Working with Gen Z. This is a show where we look at the hopes and aspirations of the Gen Z generation. Friends, we've often said that the business place is becoming more and more complex, primarily driven by all the changes that are happening in the external environment, led by technology changes, led by the geopolitical shifts that we're seeing, the wars, climate change, and so on and so forth. And it's putting increasing amount of pressure in companies today to not only just survive, but sort of keep up with what comes next on the horizon. The innovation cycles are becoming much smaller. The imitation cycles from learning from competitors are equally becoming shorter. So what does that company do? How do we look around to see that what's on the horizon? We've got two very good examples. Just if you look at very recently with the COVID, and we had predicted a pandemic, a full-blown global pandemic for 2 years. We're also looking at all the changes that are happening with AI, with Gemini and ChatGPT and Sora and so many things that are happening, saying with the doomsday prediction of what it could do to workplace and jobs and so on and so forth. So if this is the world that we're living in now, and it doesn't seem to going to get any slower, how can companies prepare for what's going to be in the future? Now, traditionally, looking out in the future is not an exercise that's new to companies, not new to managers. Strategic thinking and terms like that have always been around, but the context seems to have changed drastically. And therefore, how do we kind of make sense, not just around the corner, but even perhaps look at future and a future which becomes even more hard to predict? But that's where we bring in the futurists. And more and more companies are investing in what we call as futurists, who help look at some of these in a slightly different way. And that's what we'll try and understand, that, how does that change from the traditional things like scenario planning and, long-term exercise planning and so on. And so we'll focus and try and get a little bit of understanding on what is that, how does that work, maybe some examples. But more importantly, we'll also try and understand that the young Gen Z generation for whom we're doing this show, can they contribute in this, right? They're very tech savvy. So are there things that we can learn from them in that process? And to help me with that is my guest, Dr. John Sweeney. Dr. John Sweeney, welcome to the show and great to have you. And John, thank you once again. I know you've been busy traveling, so we're very glad this is happening. Just before we dive in with all the questions, I'm going to take, as we've done with all our guests, to take a couple of minutes to read your rich bio. And so Dr. John Sweeney is the UNESCO Chair of Future Studies in Anticipatory Governance and Sustainable Policy Making at the Westminster International University in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. He also currently serves as the co-editor, chief of World Futures Review, a journal of strategic foresight. He also serves on the graduate faculty for the University of Houston Master's Program in Strategic Foresight. As a practitioner, consultant, and educator, John has organized, managed, and facilitated workshops and seminars, multi-stakeholder projects, and foresight games and simulations in more than over 50 countries and 5 continents, in person and online with participants around the world. He's worked with companies like Asian Development Bank, CDC, the Interpol, GIZ, the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, Nesta, WHO, and a long, long list. And a little more information at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, where he instructed undergraduate courses in future studies, in political science and world religion. John also served as a researcher at the University of Hawaii for future studies from 2009 to 14. And from 14 to 18, he served as a deputy director at the Center for the Post-Novel Policy Future Studies. In December 2018, he got a PhD under Dr. Jim Tater. John is a member of the World Future Studies Federation, Association of Professional Futurists, and he's been published in Futures and Foresight Science, the Journal of Futures Studies, World Futures Review, and other academic media outlets. So I can go on, but John has asked me to keep it brief. So John, delighted to have you, and I hope all is well.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. Everything is great, and I'm really delighted to be here.
Okay, lovely, John. So let's get to it. We've been talking about how the world is changing, and who better to kind of tell a little more about that, all the things that are happening and what it means. Now, let's try and kind of decode some simple terminology first. Like I said at the introduction, futurist. What does a futurist do, right? And How is that different than the conventional, senior managers always been asked to think, hey, have a look at the future and have a look at what's in the corner, right? So help us to understand in terms of the role, like, is that any different, or is it just kind of a new lexicon that's been put in the management literature?
Yes, well, this term is used quite broadly. So the one thing I would say that comes with calling yourself a futurist is obviously having to create some definition and to kind of really establish that as a term, because it gets used by people with no training. It gets used by people who decide they wake up and want to think about the future. So from my perspective, a futurist is someone who, through rigorous methods, through research, helps an individual, a company, an organization, even an entire country or globally think about the future. But not only thinking about the future, it's actually having the ability and capability to then help people reflect on their thinking about the future. So it does require everything from sociological analysis to economics to a bit of psychology, because really a lot of what we're after is trying to bring out those assumptions, to surface those mental models and blind spots, to really create a space to think about the future in more critical and creative ways. And so a lot of it has to do with asking questions. A lot of it has to do with trying to look at things from a different point of view. There's lots of people that focus on actual experiences from the future. So trying to bring different aspects of the future into the present through experiential modes. And I use games and simulations. And so at the end of the day, it's not about replacing strategic planning or replacing management, but it's about enhancing them. It's about strengthening them. It's about how can we make risk management more broad and have more depth in its analysis. So I see it as really a way to enhance a lot of the processes that a leader would use to be able to actually create more robust, more forward-looking decision-making in the here and now.
Okay. All right. So I want to spend a little bit of time just maybe unpeel a few more layers to understand this a little deeper before we kind of go and shift our focus to Gen Z. So uh, that makes sense. Obviously, it seems like you're looking at many more dimensions to, kind of look at the future. So let's pull back to say, if a company is undergoing and getting and undertaking an exercise like this, right? Help us to understand, it's one thing typically, and this is where you can share something where there is a offsite that happens where they will take and fly everybody to a Bali location or wherever else, right? And you do this for 2 days and off you go. Now, the big question always becomes is that, how do you build that muscle? In other words, what's that journey like? Do you do a one-off and give a, sort of an injection and say, hey, we've talked through this, and how far out do you go, right? Do you go 2 years, 3 years, 5 years? Does that even hold place considering so much is changing? I mean, people can question that. Why even do that, right? Because even even the quarterly planning model is being questioned. Strategies getting reshaped, not daily but hourly, right? So two questions there. One is, of course, the duration in terms of if we were to do this kind of. That's one, and second, how far out do you go to get some anchoring in this?
Yeah, well, this is a great question, and I'll start with the latter. So what I typically want to do is to exactly call into question that familiar strategy cycle, right? That 3 to 5 year comfort zone that a lot of organizations have. And exactly to your point, now the types of changes that we're seeing happen, whether it's geopolitical conflicts or supply chain disruptions, are requiring far more emergent strategy. So oftentimes with a futures exercise or foresight, I just want to get far enough away from the present where I can't assume that everything will be the same. So there isn't really a magic number. I've worked on projects that have been 60 years into the future. And we don't do that because we are actually trying to predict or forecast the future. We just want to step into that space so that our mental models have to be different, so that we have to imagine different possibilities of change. And of course, the most common example, as you note, is the kind of the offsite, right? The special workshop, the kind of the boardroom foresight approach. And that still has a lot of value if leaders want to dive into questions. But more and more, foresight is becoming participatory. It's using different approaches to leverage the collective intelligence that an organization or even a government really needs to be able to understand issue a far more localized point of view and really to understand different impacts. So I would say that there is a lot of interest still in those kind of, away day type of engagements, but now more people are looking for different approaches that can really activate the brain power that an organization, institution, a community, or a government really needs to be able to tackle these big questions.
Sure. So, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Now, do you in your experience, again, two questions here. In your experience, um, uh, for the companies who may have done it successfully, or are trying to be as close as they feel that, hey, listen, we always got to be keep pushing the boundary. What is it that they do? In other words, do they do more of this frequently rather than the one-off? That's number one. And number two, it all sounds great, right? And then typically, I would imagine that if you're talking, workshop, whether it's an offsite or wherever, the senior leaders always have some form of resistance. They think, John, this is great, but I've got to worry about next quarter and my investors and the earnings that, if I fall short, I may not even be around, right? So what are some of the most common roadblocks or blocks that you get? So two questions again. One is, what are some of the roadblocks that typically you get as you undertake this? And for the companies who you admire, and maybe you can name one or two where you can say that, they continue to kind of do this, or they repeat this at a certain frequency or whatever, right?
Yeah, so this is always the question. This is what we call the sort of the Monday morning sort of like issue, right? If I go back to the office on Monday, what do I do with this, right? It's wonderful that we could step back and think about the future and different possibilities, but how do I actually bring this back to my organization in a meaningful way? So how I often like to end engagements, and it really varies, right? Are we doing a strategy focused engagement? Is it policy planning? Is it decision making? So oftentimes a lot of those outputted up front based on, what we're trying to feed into. But I often end with this, okay, I want people to think about three things. What's something that they want to learn based on the engagement that we've had? What's a conversation that they want to have based on the engagement that we've had? And then is there some action that they can take within the organization within a very short period of time? And I try to establish those as commitments, because a lot of times you go off and you have that experience, or you have this sort of contained space to question, and then you go back to normal on a Monday. So I really try to get those commitments and that accountability to sort of follow up to be able to do that. To your point, this really highlights the importance of having a continuous practice. So there was a 7-year study of multinationals in Europe that do foresight. And what they found was those that fell into the vigilant category, those that invested in having a continuous practice of foresight, they actually were more profitable than their peers, and they had a bigger market cap. So what it's suggesting is there really is a business case for foresight. And so there are some really great examples. Bosch was one, DHL was another. Of course, Royal Dutch Shell has had a long-standing foresight practice for decades. So lots of organizations realizing that, of course, foresight is very much about trying to bring different perspectives, broaden points of view, enhance risk management or strategy or planning. But actually, it can have a real value to the organization, whether it's innovation or thinking about very operational decisions as well.
Sure. Excellent. And some of the companies that you mentioned, John, whether it's Bosch or DHL, right? Was it more that they're happy and involved in the process, or did you sense that, maybe if you work directly or not, but where was there something that they almost, for example, like a lot of companies, just woke up one fine day and didn't have a work from home policy, and they had to adjust sort of on an SOS basis. But some companies transitioned it beautifully, and so, even for some of the supply chain disruption they were doing, there's always the kind of the backup of if company A or country A doesn't work out, then I don't go from I go from China to somewhere else. So I'm just wondering, like, were there specific things that you sense that helped them, or do you just feel that having to do this routinely have made them a little more nimble in terms of adapting?
Yeah. Well, certainly there were lots of organizations that I think were really left flat-footed by a lot of the challenges that, COVID in particular had raised. I would say that certainly the organizations that had real practices around innovation, that had that sort of operational or even the strategic agility that I think foresight can help to bring, really were able to adapt and to move. So I wouldn't have, one particular example of a company that I think did everything well, because I think this is another thing about foresight is, of course, even though many people were anticipating exactly something like this, certainly there was a precedent that the particularity of when it's happening clearly requires sometimes even, novel foresight, right? Or engaging with, what's sort of playing itself out. So certainly there are lots of organizations that tried to pivot and tried to shift exactly on these types of policies. But for the most part, right, the dynamics of how COVID unfolded, which also too, I think were certainly, brought lots of questions to bear around, workplace and health and other issues that really, I think, challenged organizations to not only look forward, but of course to look in. So I would say specifically that one of the things that foresight has been able to do is to help them think about the implications and understand as they're going through the process. So, for example, lots of organizations that wanted to focus on what they might do next really came to the fore during COVID. So I actually was working with the Center for Disease Control in the US, looking at some of these issues and questions. And they have a longstanding relationship with the University of Houston, where I teach in the graduate program of foresight.
Yeah. Okay. Super. And do you find, John, just on that are the technology companies kind of, more leaning towards that kind of an exercise just because, the change or, it's not a linear curve there, or are there, like obviously you mentioned Bosch and DHL, these are non-technology companies, but have you seen that predominantly that there are more tech space-based companies who rather do that versus, the traditional old economy companies where it's brick and mortar or just different verticals or different industries? What have you seen?
So what's interesting, and having had also the experience myself of working for a startup in London many years ago that was in the Web3 space, that the kind of thinking that I think is inherent to the foresight, what we call futurist thinking, I think actually is intuitive to kind of this startup sort of mindset. You're constantly sort of like scanning for signals. You're running different scenarios. You have this kind of agility first. You're open to the pivot. You're trying to really think about how you can move forward, not only on a daily basis, but also move towards that goal, right? So you're doing sprints, but you're doing sprints with a purpose. And I actually think what's interesting is that a lot of that mindset, a lot of those practices really are what we're trying to get some of these more established, or even we might even say bureaucratic or archaic organizations to think about. I think it's when these organizations, go for a long time. So for example, I was the foresight coordinator for the Red Crescent, right? It's a 150 plus year old humanitarian organization, and it's hard to change. Yeah. So a lot of times foresight is brought into those organizations where change is quite difficult, versus if you're at a startup where change is the normal. Change is assumed, right? And you might pivot in a relatively short period of time. So I think that the tech space shows a lot more fluidity there. And there are lots of tech companies that do utilize this and again, bring this in, whether it's in a risk management perspective, whether it's maybe even in HR to support leadership with training or capability, or even in the context of a strategy or an innovation team.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Now, do you find as you in terms of actually doing the exercise, are there particular tools, or would you rather label everything broadly under foresight? Like, so scenario planning, like if you back in the day when we all did MBA, right? There was the scenario planning. I mean, has that just been replaced, or are there other tools that we won't go into the tools themselves, or would you say that foresight broadly is trying to kind of, you know, look at that approach or look at the exercise, or are there other tools?
Yeah, so most people actually learn about or come to foresight through scenarios. They have some type of experience, like you said, whether it's an MBA module or whether it's through an organizational exercise. Scenarios kind of fall into that mainstay method space. But increasingly, there have been a lot of other approaches that leverage either design different approaches that are more experiential. I use a lot of games and simulations precisely because we're trying to create more innovation in how we engage people, but we're also learning more that it's critical to meet people where they are. So one quick example, when I was at the Red Cross Red Crescent, we had a challenge doing a global strategy for 10 years. How do we talk to an organization of somewhere between 11 and 14 million people? It's impossible to know exactly how many people, and how do we engage with them? And specifically, how do we engage volunteers? So we worked with a partner to build a game about the future of the organization that was played on WhatsApp. And this was all about how could we connect with people. And at the end of it, we had about 4,000 players in 120 countries playing in 6 languages. Now, that would have been impossible to do any other way. So this was one thing where we kind of brought the technology and the interface of the game together to be able to create more engagement. And more of those types of examples are becoming far more popular and more widely used.
Yeah. And do you sense, John, that for this to be taken seriously, right? Do you sense that do companies tend to trickle it down? In other words, even while this is a exercise of looking at the future, do you sense that is it confined to a group of people? Like the example that you gave, right? I mean, you have a legacy organization, but they beautifully used technology, right? And even while you're, let's say, a tech space or any other company, just trying to predict what happens, what have you seen? In other words, do my top 50 kind of play around with future ideas, or do I take that and just keep bringing it down so that maybe all can start thinking about it? And that's where I want to come about Gen Z, but it's curious to know, yeah, what you've seen.
Yeah, so some of the most interesting processes have been the ones that have been far more focused on creating broader engagement. So a lot of times there's a core team that might develop something, or maybe even a certain sector of the organization or a certain vertical has a question or an issue, and actually bringing that out to the whole organization, or even having country level engagements like I've had with the UN system. So I see immense value in trying to create a greater space for more people to contribute to this type of analysis and engagement. And mostly it's around leveraging the collective intelligence. A lot of times also it can create some psychological safety or trust within the organization as well, because someone gets hired on and they say, look, this vision, this mission, it's just a sign on the wall, right? What does that mean to me? So getting people in these spaces to be able to have that voice or feel like they're in an organization that wants to learn is now really critical. And I think that's where foresight can help to play a role, especially with these more participatory approaches.
Yeah. Okay. And so now shifting a little bit and towards the younger generation, which is where we're doing this episode. Where, John, what have you seen? So you obviously mentioned that it'd be in an ideal situation, it'd be good to trickle it down, or yes, a lot of companies are trying to do that. But when I'm planning for it, do companies go about making a kind of a cross-functional cohort and even an intergenerational cohort, right? And that's where I like to kind of ask my second question. How do you see the young Gen Z contributing in this process? I mean, that's the big question about for our episode here, to say that, do you sense that, is that should companies just ignore them? Because there are two sides to the story. There's one view that says it is so far tech savvy. I mean, much more than maybe some of the elder generations, without any offense to anyone, but at the same time, they're relatively inexperienced, right? So do we perhaps use their context of just knowing technology so much more better, perhaps, in this process? What have you seen? What do companies do?
Yeah, so Gen Z has an extraordinary advantage in being a truly digital native generation. And so I think the opportunity to be able to leverage those insights and perspectives is absolutely critical. So there are lots of organizations that I would say fall typically into that more conservative or bureaucratic sort of, category that have really challenged themselves by trying to say, how do we bring these voices forward? So, one quick example, when I was working with Interpol, one of the things that they were really trying to invest in and to bring out and to help to support, specifically police chiefs with, was the development of reverse mentoring programs. So, how do you bring in a younger Gen Z a policeman or policewoman who can actually support a chief to have a conversation about technology, to think about, what does it mean to use this in different ways? And of course, to bring out not only those skills, but also those perspectives as well to enrich that thinking and that decision making.
Right. And so let's flip it now. If I'm a young Gen Z, right? I'm 24, 25, and obviously I know a lot of these tools. I know technology. I'm very comfortable with them. What advice or what would you tell them? In other words, that's a generation, rightly or wrongly, leaving aside the stereotypes, are perhaps like happy with what they're seeing now. A 25-year-old is probably not saying that, hey, I'm not worried about, what may happen in this company 30 years from now, even though they're very passionate about climate and sustainability and all these other things, right? So what advice would you have? In other words, can they read up more, or can they become a little more serious so that, their reverse mentoring starts becoming, a much more people see that a little more seriously?
Yeah, so I think most importantly is, you really have to meet, different people where they're at. So I think, thinking about the types of issues that Gen Z is passionate about and how you might bring that forward, or how organizations might even think about a project or a program that is as radical as this, like reverse mentoring, is really to be able to say, okay, what is the value that this is going to create? And how is this going to not only bring something forward for the organization, but of course the people that are involved in the process as well. And time again, really what these types of experiences build, and what the research is really suggesting, is that it is about trust, it is about psychological safety. And another aspect of that is, can you actually create experiences that makes Gen Z want to stay? Because certainly in lots of corporate spaces, Gen Z is quite nomadic with regards to its, professional sort of trajectory. So the idea is, how do you actually create this attachment to the organization? What does it mean to establish a bond and to build those? And so I think these types of experiences can help to build that. And so, from the perspective of what Gen Z needs to do, clearly it is about trying to establish on the front end, okay, what does my relationship with this organization look like? How do I understand, and what am I really investing and committing myself to? And sometimes, of course, that's, hard to make clear on both sides. But I think the more that can happen, the more that these types of experiences can actually pay greater dividends.
Sure. And what have you seen, John? Whether it's specifically talking about foresight, or this exercise of looking out, but in your experience, considering that you work with so many senior people around the world, and we're talking about Gen Z, right? Do you sense, or have you facilitated? My sense would be to have an external person who is a little more objective can facilitate. But do you sense that companies are succeeding in trying to bring intergenerational collective intelligence together, right? So, do you sense that there is progress there, or there are some success stories? Because a lot of the work, or a lot of the companies that I work with, right? This debate about hybrid, right? People are just saying the two extremes, right? Either I quit or I come to work. And so, what do you see? Is there a role that a manager has to play? In other words, do they have to be much more supporting? At the same time, the Gen Z has to be much more respecting of, who's on the other side. What do you see?
Yeah, so basically, because a lot of organizations are caught in this cycle, which is the president or the present moment, and what we expect in the future is far more turbulent. So actually, there's an inherent drive and desire to be more conservative, right? We have to go to what we know. We have to peel back. But of course, then there is a greater feeling that, well, we need to maybe do something and think further about the future and how do we do that? So it's constantly this tension that you brought out earlier between, the future and what might be able to be versus the demands of the now. And so I think ultimately I wanted to highlight that because when I think more and more about how Gen Z is operating in the landscape of not only the corporate environment but even more broadly. It is about trying to establish these spaces so that there is shared learning and discovery. And I think that's what's really critical from my perspective, is thinking about like how to actually create that space and how to make that space something that's interesting and intriguing. And so I think from my perspective and a lot of the work that I'm trying to do is how to be able to establish that. Now, I'm always the external, which is to say that, my job is to help create that outside perspective. And I think actually the one thing that Gen Z really has that maybe doesn't get enough attention is they already think in systems. They think about things in the context of ecologies. So that means actually from an organizational perspective, you need outsiders. You need different parts of the ecology, different perspectives, different points of view. And so there is this space where actually having that and bringing that forward and not just getting locked into that groupthink is really critical.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. All right. So, John, couple final questions. One, of course, is to say that as we conclude, what would you say is kind of the call to advice or call to action for a manager in taking on this and taking in a very serious manner in terms of the do's and don'ts, just purely from a perspective of making foresight as part of their DNA or sort of their culture, to kind of the do's and don'ts, and then maybe as also on the Gen Z side, the do's and don'ts, right? So two there. And then the final question is there one or two companies that you admire, I mean, among all your work, who you say that, these guys are always trying to be at the forefront, and it doesn't have to be, their record of, hey, I mean, come up with X amount of, innovations, but the fact that they believe in the process, they believe in the the investment of the philosophy rather, right? So two final questions.
Yeah, so I'll start with the example. One of the I think most inspiring sort of commitments publicly to foresight that's come out recently was IKEA, and IKEA basically pronounced that they weren't going to be stuck in this 3 to 5 year strategy cycle anymore. That they were going to focus more on emergent strategy, and that foresight was going to be a critical part of that. And so there was an article in the Harvard Business Review, and they said, look, scenarios are part of our DNA now. We're an organization that wants to engage with possibilities. And I think that type of public pronouncement, that type of accountability, not only to themselves, but to the whole organization, and say, like, we're going to do this, is really a sign that, senior leadership at the top is taking it seriously, but also they're telegraphing to the entire organization and even globally that this is something that has value. And so I think that's a great sign of an organization that is really trying to put learning first and trying to attempt to engage in more critical and creative thinking about the future. When I think about the do's and don'ts and how I would weave in sort of Gen Z and foresight, I would say find those spaces, and if they don't exist, create them. How can you have shared learning? What can you actually do? And to your earlier point, maybe it's not 2 days in Bali, maybe it's a space in the office. So years ago, I won't name the organization, they really struggled to get ideas. They said, we know we have ideas, but how do we get them? And I said, well, what if you had this space called a what if wall? And the what if wall was, we have this black paint that you can write with chalk on it. And magically, over time, what if ideas started to emerge, and that actually led to different conversations in the organization, and I've remained in touch, and ultimately it led to some shifts in practice and process. So I think it doesn't have to be big, it doesn't have to be expensive. It can be something that you can bring into the culture of the organization and help to normalize it. My colleague in South Africa, Geshe, has a great metaphor. We think of foresight as the crystal ball, but what if we thought of foresight as the toothbrush, as the brushing our teeth, the thing that we do every day that we know over time helps to create health. But there's the immediate benefit, right? We don't want to walk in anywhere with the bad breath. So I think this idea of like building health over time and having that healthy mindset is what we need to do. And a lot of times that means foresight is about shifting our mental models, shifting the language that we use, shifting the metaphors, the stories that we tell about things. So if we get away from the crystal ball and we move to the toothbrush and we see foresight as something that we have to do to be healthy as a lifestyle change, I think that's the biggest do. And so I think these don'ts are to get away from, the forecast and prediction, not that probabilities, not important, but we need to focus on spaces of shared learning and discovery, utilizing collective intelligence that can really drive that trust and psychological, and ultimately to be able to think about how the organization can leverage that in a meaningful way, which means it has to be grafted on or integrated into different parts and processes that the organization is using.
All right, lovely. I really like the analogy. It's trusting the process, right? And it's the discipline, right? It's the discipline what gets you growing, not so much just the motivational one time saying, "Yay, all right, I got an expert, and then let me just do a 2-day exercise." So I really like the brush analogy. And yes, I don't think any of us can afford not to brush every day. So very well said, John. This has been fabulous. I know I could go and perhaps we could do another episode on how foresight could actually work, but I really wanted to get a perspective of the importance of foresight and how good companies are using it, right? And how do we use the intergenerational power within the system to make it happen, specifically the Gen Z, and it's more the practice, as you rightly said. So really enjoyed it, John. This has been very, very helpful. I hope your global travels make you and bring you to this beautiful country in India. And I'd love to meet you in person and look forward to working again. And thank you again for this great episode. And we'll talk soon. Take care.
Great. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you.